Lesson, you will learn how to look at a piece of music and determine the key. As you watch this lecture, I would encourage you to pause the video to take notes, rewind to listen to material that may not have been clear at first, or fast forward through topics that you are comfortable with. After you've watched the video, I would encourage you to look at the Chopin Preludes and practice identifying the key of each. Here's a hint. The preludes are arranged by key, and there's a pattern to the way that they're arranged. See if you can figure this out. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to determine the key, either major or minor, of a complete piece of music, and to determine the key of an excerpt of a complete piece. First, take a minute to open the file in Canvas for Heidenröslein by Schubert, and go online either to YouTube or the library's streaming audio collections and listen to it a few times so you're familiar with how it goes. I've also provided a link to a translation of the text so that you can understand what they're singing about. Have a look at the key signature. Every key signature, of course, implies two possible keys, one major and one minor. For instance, if you see two sharps in a key signature, the piece is most likely in the key of D major or B minor. There are some exceptions to this, particularly as far as excerpts are concerned, and we'll explore them in a little bit. The next thing you want to do is to determine which of the two keys best suits the piece. More often than not, the last note in the lowest sounding voice will be the tiebreaker. Sometimes the first note in the lowest voice will tell you, especially if it's the same as the last note. The upper voices are less reliable in this regard. Take a look at Heidenröslein and take a minute to listen to it if you haven't already. The music is by Franz Schubert, and the text is by the German poet Goethe. The song is about a boy who threatens to pick a rosebud. In the second verse, the rosebud tells the boy that he will prick him if he tries to pick it. In the third verse, the boy picks the flower and, you guessed it, gets pricked by the thorns. If we look at the beginning of the piece, there is only one sharp in the key signature, an F sharp, which indicates that the piece is probably in G major or E minor. If we look at the last note in the left hand of the piano part, the bass clef, we see that it's a G. The first note in the piano part is also G. In fact, G figures prominently throughout the piece. G is also the last note in the voice part. In light of this evidence, we would say the piece as a whole is in the key of G major. Take a moment to open the score for Chopin Preludes and scroll down to Prelude No. 4, which is on page 7. Take a moment to find a recording of it and listen to it a few times. There is one sharp in the key signature, an F sharp, which indicates that the piece is probably in G major or E minor, just like the Schubert. If we look at the last note in the left hand of the piano part, the bass clef, we see that it's an E. The first note in the left hand of the piano is a G. We need a bit more evidence to make a conclusive decision here. The right hand, the treble clef, starts on B and is centered around B for most of the piece. However, it ultimately ends on E. Perhaps more importantly, we see that the next to last note in the right hand is a D sharp, which we recognize as the leading tone in E minor. Remember when we talked about minor scales, we mentioned that composers often raise scale degree 7 in a minor mode to preserve that strong T-Do tendency. Leading tones are often a good tiebreaker in cases like this. If you see one note in the piece that is repeatedly raised throughout, and it could possibly be scale degree 7, that is to say it's a half step below one of your two key choices, then chances are the piece is in the minor mode. Scroll down to Prelude No. 7 on page 10. It has three sharps in the key signature, so our choices are A major and F sharp minor. The piece begins on E's on both staves, and it ends on A's. There are some accidentals, but none of them are E sharps, which would be the leading tone in F sharp minor. Because of that, we can ignore the accidentals and go with our first choice of A major. Sometimes composers will change keys in the course of a piece in order to create variety or tension. Typically, they will only add accidentals, they won't insert a new key signature. This process is called modulation. You'll learn more about it later in the theory sequence, but for now you just need to be able to identify it. Take a look at the second line of Haydn-Roest's line. We've already established that the piece as a whole is in G major. The second line has one sharp in the key signature and begins with G in the bass, but as the music unfolds, we see the addition of C sharps, which I've circled in red, and a temporary pause on the note D. Both the voice and piano parts under the fermata feature D prominently. Because of this information, we now have two sharps, F sharp and C sharp, and a temporary pause on D. We can say that this section of the piece is in D major. This does not change the overall key, though. We move now to a slightly more complex example from a trio sonata by Arcangelo Corelli. The key signature includes two flats, a B flat and an E flat, which suggests either B flat major or G minor. There are a few factors that make this example more complicated than the previous ones. First, we only have an excerpt here, not the complete piece, so looking for the last note won't help us. Second, the first note in each part is a C, which doesn't support a claim of either B flat major or G minor. If we look at the body of the piece, we see a few accidentals, B naturals, which I've circled in red, and A flats, which I've circled in green. Notice, though, that not all of the A's are lowered, some are A naturals. Well, B natural could be the leading tone in C minor, and we know that sometimes composers will raise scale degrees 6 and 7 in minor keys. Scale degree 6 in C minor would be A flat. If we raise it, it becomes A natural. And so we have B naturals, A naturals, sometimes A flats, sometimes B flats. Based on that information, we can say that this excerpt is in C minor. This is a very unusual and rather rare exception to the rule of key signatures and the process of key finding. In Baroque music and earlier, that is, music written before about 1750, composers would sometimes use what are now called Dorian key signatures. These only ever happen in minor keys, and they only ever have one fewer flat than normal. For example, D minor would be written with no accidentals in the key signature, whereas ordinarily it would have one flat. These exceptions occur under only these specific circumstances, and they're quite rare. So our three steps for determining the key of a complete piece or an excerpt of a complete piece are as follows. Look at the key signature and determine which two possible keys are suggested by the key signature. Consider the starting and ending notes in both the lowest and highest sounding voices, or instrumental parts, and consider accidentals within the music. See if you can locate a leading tone or a raised scale degree 6, or if the accidentals are just for decorative purposes. At this stage I will indicate for the most part when accidentals are decorative so that you know to ignore them, but later on you're going to be expected to discern that on your own. So hopefully at the end of going through this lesson you should be able to determine the key of a complete piece of music and determine the key of an excerpt of a complete piece of music. Once you're comfortable with this process, I would encourage you to go back and look at all of the Chopin preludes and practice identifying the key of each. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the preludes are arranged by key, and there's a pattern to their arrangement. I'll give you another hint. There is one prelude in every major and minor key. That's why there are 12 major keys and 12 minor keys. If you have any questions about the material, I would encourage you to post them to the discussion board on Canvas. Feel free also to answer your classmates' questions as well. It counts toward class participation. Last but certainly not least, there is no quiz accompanying this model or this module, and so feel free to enjoy the 5 minutes of your life that you get back from that.